Before I actually get into showing you what I do differently from other luthiers, I thought I'd give you a little bit of a background. And although what I'm going to be showing you is relatively technical, it's nothing that any ordinary person can understand. But the important thing is that all of this testing that I do and all of the careful voicing and so on is aimed at producing a guitar that's a real thrill to play. I came to guitar making as a player, and what's a thrill to me is to pick up a guitar, particularly a nylon string guitar, which you can't go to an ordinary music store and buy and play a good one. Is to pick up a guitar and have it really invite me to play it. The traditional way that a guitar maker tests wood is by what I call the touchy-feely method, where you flex it cross grain to test for cross grain stiffness. You flex it long grain for long grain stiffness, and you hold it up like so and tap on it, and you listen to the ring of the wood. Now, this happens to be a European spruce, which and I don't think it's a particularly good one, but a species, a kind of wood that really has a great tap tone, and I think you can hear this on the video, is this piece of redwood. It rings like a bell, and it goes on for 3 or 4 seconds. You compare that to something that's really bad. This is my standard of badness. This is a piece of, obviously, a piece of corrugated cardboard, and it has a tap tone like that. Thub. Nothing. So somewhere between redwood and cardboard, we have European spruce, we have western red cedar, and those are pretty much all of the soundboard materials that I use in my guitars. European spruce, I think, is really in the end the best, but it does take some really extensive playing of the instrument for the spruce guitar to really come into its own. I had an instrument that when I first strung it up, this is about 4 or 5 years ago, when I first strung it up, I really disliked the instrument. I thought, I've made a really bad guitar here. And for about the first month, it didn't sound musical at all. I kept playing it, and it began to sound a little bit more like a guitar after a month. Nobody seemed to want it, and I kept it around and played it for a year and a half or 2 years. And at the 2-year point, it's blossomed. It may have been a little earlier than that, but a year and a half, 2 years, that guitar became a really special instrument. So the very first thing that I do is a series of tests on soundboards and backs that I'm thinking of building with, but I want to make sure that I've separated the excellent wood from the very good wood, and the best way to do that, I think, is by this series of tests. We really like to have wood that's stiff, so that we can thin it down thin enough to make a good sounding instrument. Okay, the very first thing we do is measure the thickness of the piece of material, and since the stiffness readings that we get are very much dependent on how thick the piece of material is, I measure in 10 places around the perimeter of the piece of wood and take an average, because the stiffness varies by the cube of the thickness, for those of you who have a little technical background. So we get a thickness number that goes on our data sheet. Then we get length, and we get width, and that gives us the volume. We then weigh it. This is just a postal scale, and that's good enough. That gives us a weight for that particular piece of wood. So then the very first test I do for to get some kind of idea of how stiff this piece of wood actually is using this test setup here, which has a thing called a dial indicator. It reads in thousandths of an inch, so we can get a very accurate idea of how much this piece of wood is going to bend when we put a weight on it. And that number goes into a spreadsheet, and we will soon have a true stiffness number for this particular piece of wood. First thing I do is to put a what I call a biasing weight on there, and that's just to make sure that we're down pretty snug against these rails out here. Then I insert a known weight. It doesn't really matter too much how much this weighs. It's roughly 2 pounds. I think it's 1.92 pounds or something like that. I just need to know what it is. That slides in here, and we get a reading on our dial indicator of how much it deflects. So then I've got another pair of rods here, which are about a ½ inch lower than these outside guys, and they're going to give me a cross-grain stiffness deflection. And again, I put a biasing weight on here to get things to snug down to the rods there. And at that point, I would set the dial indicator to 0, and so that we're measuring just the deflection of the weight. Now this is about a 4-pound weight, and that goes on there like so. And we take another reading for cross-grain stiffness. So those two numbers go on the data sheet, and that really constitutes all of the simple mechanical stiffness and density testing that we do. Because we know the weight, because we know the volume, we can calculate the density. I use, for flamenco guitar where I want a very quick response, I use low density wood. For a classical guitar where I want a long sustain and a really rich sound, I use high density wood. So there's a real dividing line here depending on what you want to do. I describe guitar making as very much like cooking. You got a lot of different ingredients, and you can mix and match to get different sounding instruments.